Hello, I'm Paul Gates. Welcome to the Academics. Unfortunately, Dave Spiceling can't be with us today, so it's just myself and our panel, Nancy Love of our Department of Government and Justice Studies, and Michael Wade of our History Department. Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to be discussing the most important part of the election, the electorate itself. Last week, I brought along a copy of Bloomberg Businessweek that devoted an entire issue to the electorate that we didn't get to last week. What they've done is they have picked 5 categories: geography, age, wealth, race, and gender. And with those 5 categories, of course, there are a total of 10 descriptions. And what they've done is they've taken those and gone through every possible permutation of those 10 categories and come up with 242 electorates. It's no news to anyone that the electorate is divided, but along what lines have we really got 242 electorates in this election? And have things changed? Does this represent some kind of shift? Of course, this is data analytics that allows this to be made, but what does that represent? And are we pockets of all different interests and orientations?
An interesting article recently in The Monkey Cage by Liliana Mason about how the electorate is increasingly sorted into groups. Now, I'm not sure 242, but I think that's partly a phenomenon of the development of filter bubbles online, which allow people to receive and read only information that agrees with their preconceptions. So the divisions within the electorate are being reinforced, and that also contributes to a less informed electorate.
Sure, that notion of selective exposure
exactly.
has been around for a while. Mike?
I think I'm reminded of a statement about geology by Matthew Simmons, who owns the largest energy bank in the world. And he says the problem with petroleum exploration today is that it was being run by Nintendo geologists, people who sat in front of their computer screens and, oh, look at that, isn't that pretty? This analysis, such as it is, reminds me of that. The only thing that's missing from it is real people. They've been, in effect, fragmented into groups which may or may not be real. Mm-hmm. I do think that there's a growing problem with the electorate. Part of it has to do with frankly, the growing ignorance of much of the electorate, which is not internal or intrinsic to them, but a product of all kinds of social forces. The decline in the quality of public school instruction, the distractions represented by cell phones and tweeting, years and years, now decades of commercials which peg the average mentality of American adults at age 14. I think that's had a cumulative effect over time. And the information explosion, as Nancy just indicated, has created so many discrete sources of information that anything like broader understanding has gotten sacrificed. Throw in the power of big corporations and modern campaigns with their attack ads, their distractions, and I think it's little wonder that we've got an electorate that 40% of which at least is angry. They don't quite know about what. They want to take the country back, but they show no evidence whatever that they understand who's got it, who's in charge of it.
Well, one of the things you started with, Mike, was failures of education, which have been underway for some time. Nancy, we've talked about that before. What's going on there?
Yeah, well, the systematic defunding of public higher education by state legislatures as a national trend, I think, is now starting to have an effect on the electorate. And something that's important to remember is that among the crucial components of democracy, though they disagreed about exactly whom it should reach, our founding fathers thought that public education, right, and also free elections, and saw the connection between the two of them, were central to the health of our democracy. And I have a quote I love from Franklin: "A Bible and a newspaper in every house, a good school in every district, all studied and appreciated as they merit, are the principal support of virtue, morality, and civil liberty." So I think that we need to revisit our origins in terms of the commitment to public education, and then bring that forward for a new America.
Mm-hmm. There's another quote along that line back from the founders, a letter from James Madison to the Lieutenant Governor of Kentucky, and I believe it was 1822. It's a quote you see a lot, misused in some cases, but a popular government without popular information is prologue to either a farce or a tragedy or both. Mm-hmm. And arguing for exactly the same thing. I mean, the Lieutenant Governor was contacting Madison for some advice on how they should structure a public education system in Kentucky. And so this concern obviously was at the origin of the country, and we've seen it misplayed in the years since.
Well, go ahead.
No, go on.
Well, I was going to say, if we could go back to the angry voter, which you were talking about, I think one of the things we're seeing is the devolution of the Southern strategy that developed post-1964 Civil Rights Act and was implemented by Nixon and Kevin Phillips, which was an attempt to make racist appeals to white voters and to let black voters in the South go. And Trump's doing a remix of this with his coziness to white supremacists, his failure to denounce David Duke, and also his anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim sentiment. Again, he's using race as a wedge issue, and that's contributing to anger in the electorate and also sectional divisions, because Republicans in the Southwest and in the Northeast don't like this Southern strategy. The RNC, particularly under Reince Priebus, had been trying to distance itself from it since the 2012 election, and now Trump is bringing it back.
Well, when the Republicans, in effect, took in Southern segregationists who left the Democratic Party, they also took in cultural conservatism. And that's precisely the split in the Republican Party today. The free market conservatives, on the one hand, who have their own mythology going, and the cultural conservatives, who in the main are people who are the sometimes the genetic heirs of segregationists, and certainly the psychological heirs. They're against modern science. They have a deep-seated racism, which the Southern strategy enabled them to cover with coded words. And the problem is that when you get voters who are angry about things but who don't really know what's going on, and candidates who pander to them, such as Donald Trump, that's a prescription for more trouble than we already have.
Right.
And there is no immediate fix for that, because, as you both suggested, the cause is education, for example. Christopher Lasch wrote back in the late 1970s about the growing tendency in education to infantilize students. And here we are 4 decades later almost, with not only that having continued, but a drive for vocational education, white-collar vocationalism. Problem with that is it's not really education, it's training. It's revealed by things like end of course tests and so forth. And what it has the effect of doing is narrowing the scope of education to just that. So it's no wonder that people know less and less. Accounting is a perfectly respectable field. It's not an education. Business generally can be, that's not always, respectable, but it doesn't teach you about philosophy. It doesn't teach you about the world. It doesn't teach about cultural heritage.
As education, particularly higher education, I think we're talking about, is defunded, is it hitting the humanities, for instance, harder than the vocational professions such as accountancy and that kind of thing?
Yes.
Or are we seeing it across the board?
No, it is hitting them harder, and I don't think is it all lost on the people who are doing it that they're killing two birds with one stone. They're channeling money to vocational programs, which they call professional programs. And at the same time, they are producing students and citizens who are ever less likely to raise questions. And the whole idea of the Founding Fathers was that republics are fragile and that their health and vitality depend on civic and public virtue and educated citizenry. By the way, there's this old story about Franklin walking out of the Constitutional Convention on the last day, being greeted by a woman friend, who else? Dr. Franklin, what do we have? A monarchy or a republic? And Franklin replying, a republic, if you can keep it.
Recognizing that fragility and the importance of participation, not just education, but educated participation,
Yeah.
putting that into practice.
Nancy was right. People who hone in on one source of information, and that's courtesy of the Reagan administration's ending the fairness doctrine back in the 1980s and opening up the media to monopoly control.
Right, lifting the limits
on
ownership, right? Chain
yes.
ownership, yeah. That's been underway. It started in the late '80s, like you say.
We now have the capability of propaganda that European fascists would have greatly admired.
Because of the uniformity of programming in these few hands
Yeah.
that control.
I'll just add, Gustave Le Bon, who wrote about crowd psychology, late 19th, early 20th century, talked about the prestige factor for candidates and said that money was the primary source of prestige, and that people who were in what we could now call the 99%, right, would want to be aligned with, associate themselves with the candidate who could make the claim to have the greatest wealth.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and throw in a growing cult of celebrity and people wanting to identify with fame. Yeah, it's a potent mix.
Well, let's get back to some current examples of the electorate and how they're behaving in this particular cycle. Right. The other day, it was reported that the Arizona Republic, endorsing Hillary Clinton, has drawn a fierce reaction in some quarters. Now, to kind of background that a little bit, the newspaper has never endorsed a Democratic candidate before, and we know that the Southwest is a conservative part of the country. But what has happened since, and what does that mean?
Oh, the threats, and including apparently bomb threats. Mm-hmm. I just find, I don't know, I find myself wondering, who is doing that exactly? What kinds of people, what groups? Why, for example, wouldn't people who are now responding in that way have said, have stopped to think, well, the Arizona Republic, which has always been totally reliable, if they say that Trump is not a decent candidate for the presidency, maybe we shouldn't we give that a second thought? That's really, I don't know what else to say about that. That to me is both mystifying and disturbing.
Absolutely. Nancy?
Well, another linchpin of a healthy republic, free press. And I'm also thinking about the warrant for the arrest of Amy Goodman after Democracy Now! Covered the Standing Rock Sioux protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline. So we are seeing some signs that the freedom of the press is eroding.
And what started, I think, this conversation, in my mind at least, was, bomb threats we have had before for a number of reasons. But in an election, I mean, this kind of behavior during the run-up to an election for President of the United States, this is something apart. This is different, the way it's playing out in this setting, I think. And, the democracy really depends, and we have successfully pulled it off up until now at least, on orderly transitions. I mean, we see that. We've seen that since the founding of the country. And we look at other nations and see how they have revolutions periodically and difficulty making government run smoothly and elections run smoothly. Is that now being visited on us? I mean, are we turning into a banana republic as far as the elections proceeding along the same line as they have in other countries?
Oh, I think we're watching. I think what we're seeing is the disintegration of the American political system, which didn't start with just this election. But this could turn out to be the most important election in American history. We really have massive problems in this country, which are not being addressed by either of the candidates. The best that can be said thus far is that one candidate at least has knowledge and experience and mental and emotional stability, that's I think that's what the choice ultimately is going to come down to. The one thing we cannot afford is an ignoramus in the White House.
Well, and we're going to see both of those personalities on display in the next debate on Sunday the 9th. So let's turn to that. I think at the very end of the first debate, we saw a little tension getting ratcheted up. I think Trump was getting a little more unglued in his comments, and the debate actually went a few minutes longer than scheduled, and that's when that occurred. What are we going to see in the second debate? I mean, what have we seen post debate number one that we can anticipate coming up again in the second debate?
Saw the emergence of a gender gap in response to the debate. So I think that Clinton will play further to that. And it was toward the end of the first debate where she took Trump to task for having called women pigs, slobs, and dogs. So I think she will hit harder there. And then I think we might see more questions, different questions. The format is going to change. Questions will be submitted online, and there will be a vote, and then the 30 most popular questions will be those from which the moderator will suggest. So Trump probably has also plans to hit harder against Hillary. Benghazi may be going after Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky or Jennifer Flowers. He's also been told to be better prepared, and then the question is lurking out there whether he'll even show, because he's suggested that he might not, and Clinton has said she'd be happy to take the stage solo.
Well, you're saying there, Nancy, that maybe it sounds like Trump might disregard the pre-selected questions and go off on another line of attack. Mike, is that realistic?
I don't know, but if he doesn't show, I think they ought to bring in Clint Eastwood and let him talk to a chair, or perhaps a chair with Clyde the orangutan in it. I think what we'll see is next time is the continuing evidence that professional journalism is in total disarray. I got an email in the middle of the first debate that said, "Is Lester asleep?" Borowitz, the satirist with the column in the New York Times, announced the next day that a manhunt was underway for Lester Holt, that he was missing. Yeah, I don't mean to pick on him. By all odds, he's a nice man. But the truth of the matter is that we haven't seen a decent moderation of a quote-unquote debate. Certainly not this year, and probably not in 2012 either. I think what we'll also see is, and Nancy, I think, just suggested it, is a continuation of talk that does not address the real problems facing the American Republic. Growing control by an oligarchy which has its own interests, the failure to address to say anything about the climate crisis, about the glut that is military spending in this country, about national health insurance, some sort of, even President Obama says the current plan needs attention. None of these things seem to come up.
Can we expect to see some of that stuff come up, Nancy? There's some substantive questions, I think, or discussion, not just in the second debate and the third, but in the news coverage of the remainder of the campaign. The press has certainly been taken to task for going with sound bites and good video, and which Trump's antics play to. Is that the way it's going to go, or is this suddenly going to, at some point, get serious?
Well, I thought Clinton was substantive in the first debate, and I would anticipate that she will be again. One of the things that's interesting is a Politico poll showed that she won by a significant margin in the debate, but it hasn't yet had much of a bounce for her in the national polls. So 3 to 5% bounce. So she needs to turn a debate victory into additional voter support.
What that makes me think of, Nancy and Mike, maybe you could speak to this. Is that because the two camps have hardened so much on the ends that there's not much room for persuasion or changing people's minds?
Well, I think maybe the first debate indicates that too. Substantive, yes, agreed. There was no, it was no contest,
right?
But not on these issues. And I think the problem is going to be. I asked two classes earlier this week what they thought of the debate, and they basically didn't think much of it. I got the distinct impression that many of them are not inclined to vote on Election Day. If this campaign continues to center around attack ads and Benghazi and those sorts of issues, I fear we may not have much of a turnout on Election Day, and that could be very disturbing. I think that certainly Hillary Clinton, who knows better, owes it to the voters to bring these issues up and to offer something positive in terms of where she would like to see the country headed. And she ought to appeal the voters to elect a Congress that shares the vision.
Well, the hope is for the voters to ask those questions when they submit online.
And we'll see if that indeed does come to pass. We're out of time. That's our program for this week. For the panel, I'm Paul Gates. We hope you'll join us next week on The Academics.